If the 16th and 17th centuries were the centuries in which the modern European state system developed in Europe, that didn't necessarily mean that more traditional land empires disappeared, and in the zone between Europe and China, in Central Eurasia, there were three empires that survived and indeed developed, and we're going to turn our attention to them now. I want to start with the Ottoman Empire, because in a sense the Ottoman Empire is the best bridge between Europe and Asia. The Ottomans, as we have said before, were heirs really to three different traditions, and it was this heritage that helped them survive and establish an effective empire as probably the last and the most successful of the steppe peoples. The Turkic origin Osmanli, carried out a successful empire-building enterprise, and it remained a great power for several centuries. The three traditions they were heirs to were that of the steppe with its universalism, that of Islam, also universalist and a major world religion, and that of the Roman Empire, which also had its own version of a universalist claim. But as a power that straddled the Mediterranean with its capital in Constantinople and controlling much of the Balkans during this period, as well as North Africa and the Middle East, the Ottomans were affected by the shifting of the economic center of gravity of Europe to the north and towards the Atlantic seaboard. But they still managed to remain viable and indeed to strengthen and expand during much of the 16th and 17th century. The Sultan's main residence in Istanbul, the Topkapi Palace, is a kind of model in miniature of some of these inheritances. The layout of the palace, with its various pavilions, is very much like a nomadic encampment, except that it's made of stone instead of tents. Within the palace, one sees at least 10 separate mosques, emphasizing the religious role of Islam and of the Sultan, who, after the conquest of the Arab holy cities of Mecca and Medina in the 16th century, claimed the title of Caliph, which made him the head not just of the political realm of Islam, but also of the religion. And finally, by moving his capital seat to Istanbul, as the Turkish name for Constantinople goes, he embodied his claim to the heritage of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And the Sultan's ability to make law, both in religion and in the political realm, echoes something of the role of the Roman emperor. One weakness of the Ottoman Empire was the lack of clear rules of succession. In their period of expansion and the apogee of their development, they were blessed with a series of effective and very successful sultans. But the lack of a clear succession system led to such things as a sultan coming to the throne and immediately executing all of his potential rivals for the throne, which kind of weeded out potential effective sultans, and increased the role of the harem, the secluded group of women who were wives of sultans or widows, the queen mothers, as you might put it, and the influence that they could exert on politics. The heirs to the sultan were raised in this kind of restricted, caged situation, subjected to the internal politics of the harem, and brought out to become sultans instead of gaining administrative experience. That didn't mean that the Ottoman Empire didn't have an effective administration, just that the sultans weren't given regional commands or provincial governorships to learn as they brought their way up to the throne. Instead, those positions were granted to local people, military leaders, or a recruited bureaucracy. One feature of the Ottoman administration that's quite characteristic is that, although a Muslim state, the Ottoman Empire, especially after it expanded into the Balkans, brought under its rule many Christians as well as Jews, and that it institutionalized the toleration of these religions because they were monotheistic and based upon a revealed scripture. Therefore, they were similar to, and indeed in the Quran recognized as, predecessors, incomplete partial revelations to the complete revelation of the Quran. So there was an interesting institution that took account of this existence of Christian subjects of the Sultan, a kind of protected category of subjects, but they were also drawn upon through an institution called devshirme, which is usually translated as child tax, periodic collection of likely-looking young boys from Christian villages. They would be recruited, taken to Istanbul, educated in palace schools, raised as Muslims, and assigned to roles in the administrative apparatus, either the military, where they formed the Janissary Corps, the most feared, most effective infantry army of the time, or into the administrative structures, where some of them rose to be, in fact, the chief administrative officer of the empire, the Grand Vizier. As I've said, the Roman legal administrative examples gave the Sultan ultimate authority both in religion and in civil law, and to Western observers, it looked as though the Ottoman Empire was an absolute ruler with central control that contemporary European monarchs could only dream about. It would be wrong, however, to overemphasize the effectiveness of even the quite impressive Ottoman bureaucracy, because technology of communication and simple distance made it very difficult for the center continually to stay in direct control of every part of the empire, especially on the edges, on the peripheries. So the Ottomans, demonstrating the kind of flexibility that made them effective at maintaining their empire for such a long time, generally made accommodations with local elites, played powerful military or bandit leaders off against each other, sometimes co-opting them into the system by making them governors of the region that they had been preying on as bandits to kind of pacify them and make them stop, and in generally keeping the peace through trying to co-opt rivals and balance tensions. The 17th century has long been seen by historians who know how things turned out in the end as the period when the Ottoman Empire began to decline. The siege of Vienna in 1683, when the Turks were turned back the second time at the gates of European Christendom, is taken as a marker for this decline. But it would be a mistake to hasten the feeling among Europeans at the time, or other observers at the time, that the Ottoman Empire was in decline. However, one can already begin to see emerging a long-term trend, which we'll explore in a later lecture, the influence of population. Beginning in the 17th century, the growth of the Ottoman Empire's population slowed, the natural expansion of the population. And that trend only worsened in the 18th century. Now, it wasn't necessarily a decline in the total numbers, but by slowing the growth down, the relative position of the Ottoman Empire in terms of a proportion of even the regional, much less the global world population, declined dramatically, and that seems to have gone hand in hand with political decline, at least in the long run. Another empire that in some respects shared aspects of the Ottoman heritage was the Mughal Empire in India, which we have already talked about in certain contexts. The Mughals' idea of sovereignty was derived from their claim to the heritage of Timur the Lame and Genghis Khan, therefore to the Mongol Steplander Universalist tradition, and ultimately they ran their empire in India as an empire that they ruled by the right of conquest. They treated their empire essentially as a storehouse of loot. The state made tremendous economic demands on the population, and yet the state and the court, through these demands, actually stimulated the Indian economy and made it very productive. Peasants were forced to be very inventive and seek new things to produce in order to earn the money to survive or to grow the food to survive. They produced for the market, not just for subsistence. Mughal spending on their palaces, on building projects, on incessant warfare, and on luxury items for conspicuous consumption stimulated the economy and recycled wealth back into the economy by paying off craftsmen, by paying for the delivery of goods from peasantry, and so on. Outside of a very tight core area near the Mughal capital, the Mughals really didn't have a centralized administration. As we talked about earlier, they relied on sharing the tribute that they gained with a whole network, a complicated set of relationships with allies, with clients, with relatives, which meant that they had to balance among claims of different rival groups. Those who could claim descent from Timur were one group that demanded respect and positions of influence, and yet the Mughals owed a lot to the Afghan and Persian fighters who had helped bring them to the conquest of Delhi and then the establishment of the Mughal Empire. And as the empire expanded, Hindu Indian chieftains also came under their control, and they also demanded some role in the state. Like the Ottomans, the Mughals did not have a very clear line of succession, so when a ruler died, this led to conflicts until a new ruler could establish himself. One of the most successful of the Mughal rulers of the 17th century was the Emperor Aurangzeb, who reigned from 1658 to 1707, and he hit upon a way to keep the empire stable and in balance by warring constantly along its frontiers. This kept the aristocracy occupied in waging war, and the increasing expansion of the empire gave him new land and new loot to divide among them. But this eventually, the success of this approach undermined its long-term success. As he rewarded newly acquired vassals in the southern Indian region known as the Deccan, where he was expanding, he offended his more long-term established supporters. And eventually that led to increasing internal divisions and rivalries that set the stage for the collapse of the Mughal Empire under British pressure in the 18th century. Caught between the Ottomans and the Mughals were the Safavids in Persia. This dynasty established its control in 1501 and lasted until 1773. But their location between two viable and expanding land empires meant that the opportunities for them to follow an expansionist policy were rather limited. They did show some similarities with both the Ottoman and Mughal empires. Like them, they benefited economically from their location astride important routes of trade between East and West, in particular in Persia, the old Silk Roads. Like the Ottomans, the Safavids in Persia drew on a pre-Islamic history of great kings, the Persian empires, going all the way back to classical times, as well as upon political thought to legitimate their rule. But unlike the Ottomans, they never really built a uniform bureaucracy, whether composed of slaves or of employed supporters. On the frontiers, they tended to make accommodations with local lords. They created a kind of mounted military force referred to as the Kizilbash that was used to enforce order, but they soon also began to establish themselves in the peripheral regions and to form clans and to become a player in the complicated internal game of politics in the Safavid Empire. Political legitimation in the Safavid Empire was based on religion, just as in the Ottoman Empire. But they had a different approach to religion. The Safavids became fiercely Shiite and enforced that Shiism on their realm in Persia. Unlike the Mughals, who were pluralistic and tolerated different religions, unlike the Ottomans, who at least gave tolerated, if well-taxed, status to Christians and Jews, the Safavids insisted that people convert to Shiite Islam or be expelled or killed. Enforcing Shiism by military violence worked to convert everybody, but to make them actually become emotionally attached to the religion required more. As we can see if we look at the Baroque era in Western Europe, the best way to embed a religion in people is to build on their emotional attachment through various rituals, through an emphasis, as the Safavids did in Persia, on messianic leaders and ancient martyrs. And another interesting feature of this period is the utter rejection by the Safavids of any nostalgia for a steppelander nomadic tradition, even though they could perhaps have claimed it. Instead, they created a ideology that legitimized themselves as the conquerors of the steppe nomads, as we mentioned before, when they defeated the Uzbek Khan and brought down the last Uzbek steppelander empire. Further east from the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals lay the realm of China. And in the 16th and 17th century, China went through a period of intense turmoil, civil strife, and yet it held together and indeed emerged perhaps stronger and more expansive than before. The Ming dynasty raised China to the status of one of the world's wealthiest states, a status it probably maintained almost all the way through the 18th century. The Mings ruled in China from the overthrow of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368 until their own overthrow by the Qing dynasty in 1644. In the Chinese political system, the emperor, in theory, had unlimited powers, indeed almost divine powers. But in effect, the real powers in China were the educated mandarins that made up the bureaucracy that actually administered this complex, highly civilized, and very large and highly populated realm. There are about 20,000 such mandarins who spent a long time in their childhood and youth becoming educated in the Confucian classics and earned their appointment to the imperial bureaucracy through passing a civil service exam, essentially. Their influence restricted the emperor's power in practice. And frequently, both under the Yuan dynasty and in the Ming era, emperors found themselves forced to try to play other forces in Chinese society off against the power of the mandarins. These forces might be the Buddhist clergy. They might be the court eunuchs who made up much of the sort of support staff around the imperial family in its residential area. Might be the generals of the army. But time and time again, from the 16th into the 17th century, as emperors attempted to assert their authority, to exert their will in ways that were more than just ritual, they failed because the mandarins essentially went on strike or resisted them. The decline of Ming stability was also influenced by a series of disasters and emerging strife, including peasant rebellions, that began in the 1630s and extended through the 1640s. Contributing to their eventual overthrow was also the fact that since the end of the 16th century, they had begun to rely increasingly on a nomadic, steplander-type mounted people known as the Manchu in the northeastern section of the regions where China had expanded, now known today as Manchuria, to police the Mongolian frontier. Gradually, the Manchu generals began to look to the divided, conflict-ridden central Chinese regions and ask themselves why they didn't move in to intervene. And when they did, in the middle of the 17th century, the Manchu generals were able to impose their will on most of the warlords of central China, gradually extending their control and, from 1636, establishing an ideology which they named Qing, which became the name of the new dynasty. Qing meaning something like pure with overtones of water, because the word Ming had connotations of brightness, of flame, of fire. So pure water quenches bright fire. And by 1644, the Qing dynasty was firmly in control of the center and were expanding their control into the peripheries. The last official Ming claimant to the Chinese throne was executed by the Qings in 1662, although Ming loyalists remained on the island of Taiwan until they were smoked out of their last hideouts in the 1680s. Like the Mings, the Qings found that they had to rely upon the Mandarin establishment. But this proved, most of the time, to be an actually mutually beneficial relationship. The scholar Mandarins saw in the established Qing dynasty guarantors of stability, especially because the Qing rulers deferred to the Confucian traditions. They did impose on the Chinese the humiliating demand that Chinese people shave their foreheads and wear the rest of their hair in a ponytail down their back, a queue, a pigtail, which was a characteristic feature of Chinese men until the revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty at the beginning of the 20th century. Both the Mandarin bureaucrats and the Qing emperors had a common enemy in the various local military leaders or warlords that were a recurrent feature of the strains and stresses at the local level. And of course, the Qing also had a very powerful base of support against an overweening bureaucracy of the Mandarins in the Manchu warrior elite, which they attempted to preserve. They tried to create Manchuria as a kind of preservation for the militaristic, virtuous, masculine warrior elites from which they could draw much of their military cavalry and their guardsmen and their generals. Although, as we've seen in an earlier talk, there was encroaching settlement of farmers into that region as well as into other parts of China. That pressure on the land reflected some social changes that went on in China during the 16th and 17th centuries, and major peasant rebellions had been an important part of the conflicts of the 17th century. The peasants threw off landlord controls in a series of revolts that culminated in the 1640s. And the end result was that as the Qing dynasty established itself, most land was actually transferred to smallholding peasant farmers. And so instead of belonging to landlords who controlled the peasantry, the peasants depended for credit on urban-based loan sharks who would give them loans to buy seed or to improve their land on very bad credit terms, and then drain away most of their production as a payment on the loans. This pattern, in fact, actually poisoned relations between the cities and the countryside so deeply that that kind of urban-rural divide can still be seen in China today. Another feature of the Qing period, with its turmoil, with its expansion, was a general strengthening of Chinese identity. Now, it's true that in ruling in the various regions that they expanded into, the Manchus took over local claims to legitimacy, so that in Mongolia they were referred to as Khans. In Tibet they were a Buddhist leader and supported the Buddhist elite. But everywhere they essentially favored the adoption and the spread of Chinese culture. So over time, the ethnic minorities in the peripheral regions, into which indeed much Chinese settlement was happening as refugees from turmoil spread into more Pacific regions, these ethnic minorities increasingly took on Chinese language, Chinese attitudes, and Chinese ways. In a similar way, the overseas Chinese experience, the life of those Chinese who had emigrated into Nanyang, into the South Seas, into Southeast Asia, or elsewhere around the world, to the Philippines, and even eventually, although that happened rather later, into the European-dominated imperial worlds of North and South America, or of even Africa. These overseas Chinese found themselves thrown together with other Chinese, even from very different regions. And although the importance of the clan association and the identity to your region of origin was still very, very strong, all these Chinese together in a region where they were alone among others and were a minority fostered a general feeling of identity to location and clan, superseded by a broader identity of China and being Chinese. The other great East Asian society of this period, which, surviving a period of domestic turmoil, began to enter into a period of consolidation and stability, was Japan, under the dynasty of shoguns that we call the Tokugawa shoguns. They established themselves at the turn of the 16th to the 17th century and essentially remain in control until the so-called Meiji Restoration of the mid-19th century. Unlike China or any of the other empires we've talked about, by the time the Tokugawas became shoguns, Japan was already quite homogeneous and had broadly, generally accepted political ideas about the nature of politics and about Japan as a place and about what it meant to be Japanese. But it did feel the effects of the changes of the time. By the 1630s, the Japanese rulers had decided to close out outside contact. Although we should not overstress how isolationist this made the Japanese, they wanted to close out contact with Europeans. Only once a year, and only the Dutch could come and trade with the Japanese state. But they were still open to Chinese and Korean influence, initially in government-sanctioned trade, and always in the unofficial trading that the Japanese government sometimes denounced as piracy and tried to stamp out, but without any success. The Tokugawa shoguns brought about a period of stability and economic expansion by controlling the internecine warfare among warlords and a nobleman called daimyo. This led to the rise of a money economy, in which the merchants and the peasant class prospered, but in which the traditional warrior elites, the samurai, had a much harder time of it. Many of them ended up becoming ronin, masterless, wandering warriors who had to sell their swords to whoever would promise to pay them wages. So they hired on with various daimyos in local quarrels, and then discovered that the daimyos, in fact, wouldn't pay them what they had been promised. The shoguns, through practices quite similar to what European monarchs in the early modern era did with their great noblemen, managed to control the daimyos by assigning them to different regions and moving them around, by establishing the rule that the daimyos had to maintain a residence in the capital city of Edo, now Tokyo, and sometimes even to keep hostages, members of the family, living at the court of the shoguns, so that there were levers of influence that they could use to keep a balance and to preserve the peace in the countryside. Although many daimyo clans did become very, very strong, for a long period Japan was marked by very noteworthy internal stability and economic development. In our discussion of the political and social developments of the 16th and 17th centuries in the global system, we haven't yet really considered certain regions that have things that tie them together and that make them different from Europe, Central Eurasia, and East Asia that we've already talked about. I'm referring to the world of the New World colonies and of Africa, which are joined by the importance and significance of the slave trade and the social changes that it wrought both in Africa and in the colonies in the New World. It's rather difficult to measure exactly what the impact of slavery on Africa was. We can say with some certainty, however, where most of the slaves came from. They came from the regions along the coast of West Africa, from the Congo Basin, or from what is today Angola. And they were largely gathered by raiding and warfare carried on by local Africans. Demand for slaves remained very high. In fact, except in the British North American colonies, slave communities in the European colonies in the New World did not reproduce themselves by natural increase. This meant that labor had to be continually imported from Africa through the slave trade. 500,000 slaves came from Africa to the Americas by 1700 per year. 6 million more arrived in the Americas in the century between 1700 and 1800, and that does not count the hundreds of thousands of casualties en route. That's 6 million arrived in the Americas. It is difficult to measure without firm census records, which of course simply don't exist, but it must have been that this slave trade had a demographic impact. There does appear to be some evidence suggestive of an upsetting of the male-female balance in many parts of Western Africa, where males were a preferred kind of slave and were taken away. And some regions, in fact, showed a serious decline in population as they were continually raided for slaves to feed the demand of the European colonies in the New World. What impact did the slave trade have then on the African states in the region? Dahomey may give us one example, at least, for the relationship between slavery and states that arose in Africa. Dahomey emerges in the early 17th century in the area that is today Benin, at the end of the bight, where the big curve of Western Africa begins to trend again straight southwards. It was a warrior society, highly militarized. It did not actually economically depend on the slave trade. Estimates are that slavery made up about 2.5% of its economic activity, but it was an active participant in the slave trade through raiding, through militaristic capturing of slaves in warfare. Dahomey did not tend to enslave its own people, but to gather slaves through a very warlike and militaristic society. There does appear, therefore, however, to be a correlation between the existence of the slave economy, the demands of the European slave trade for African slaves, and the levels of violence in the activities and relationship between the states of Africa, at least in the regions from which slaves were drawn. Two other states in the region, Akwamu and the Congo, may give further examples. In Akwamu, the ruler actually often sold his own subjects as slaves, using charges of adultery, which in most West African societies was considered very impious and a social evil, to imprison and sell his own subjects. Why would they do something like that? Well, rulers of African slaves could use the proceeds of the slaves trade to consolidate their own power and to get access to European weapons to defend their independence, even from Europeans. One other West African state of the time, rising a little bit later than Dahomey, is Ashanti, in the hinterland of what is today Ghana. It emerged from the 1680s and lasted as a separate state, a major significant state in the region, at least till the middle of the 18th century. And it did not depend upon slaves for its wealth. And it wasn't even a major player in the slave trade, although that gradually changed over time. It was gold, not slaves, that gave Ashanti its wealth, and it was the organization of the Ashanti Empire that made it so effective. The Ashanti rulers developed a system of well laid out roads through their territories, even through the jungles, and well-trained and effective couriers who would run along the roads. But as the 18th century developed, even the Ashanti began to rely more on slaving to supplement the gradually declining reserves of gold that they could count upon. However, it does remain an example of an African state in this era which did not arise and owe its existence to the slave trade. Now, in the new environments of North and South America, new kinds of political institutions and social structures emerged. Not because people set out to create something new. In fact, most of the colonists that arrived in the New World, North and South America, expected and felt like they should recreate the country of origin. But they met factors that forced them to correct something new. In fact, many of the things they brought with them were actually new in terms of what happened back home in Europe. In North America, where religious sectarian communities, democratically run commonwealths, or slave-run plantation economies grew up in the British colonies, none of that existed in Great Britain. And in some respects, Spanish America differed from Spain in rather similar and dramatic ways. In fact, scholars look at the 17th century as the era when the modern state emerged, when the power of the church declined, when professional bureaucracies not related to the aristocrats rose, when aristocratic independence declined. And these are more clearly seen, really, in Spain's overseas colonies than they are in Spain itself. The colonies were administered by a bureaucracy appointed by the crown. There was very little in the way of official aristocratic power. The church's influence were limited. Most church offices were appointed by the crown. And the crown, in an exertion of sovereignty, which was now much more conceived of as making laws rather than rendering judicial decisions, that sovereignty was reserved to the crown and its appointed representatives. Now, did this make the Spanish colonies a centralized, well-administered state? Hardly. They were a long way away from Spain, and even appointed royal administrators, let alone other peripheral elites or regional governors or big people in the various cities, could ignore the commands of the crown. But by and large, Spanish America was based on cities which were ruled by royal governors, administered by a bureaucracy, and with a legal system that was the final sanction and expression of sovereignty. In the New World, but in particular in the Spanish New World, completely new types of societies were also emerging. One important process is called creolization. The Creole is a term used for an inhabitant of an area where native African and European people mingled and where mixed households developed. But in particular, initially it referred to European and Native American combinations, leading to rise of distinct mentality among a people who drew on both their Native American and European heritage to develop a pride in, and indeed manufactured myths about, their Aztec aristocratic ancestry in Mexico or similar Peruvian ancestry in Inca ancestry in Peru. So a kind of a distinct Creole mentality gradually emerges, which becomes very significant as Latin America begins to separate from Spain in creating a kind of local version of identity, of what it meant to belong to the region, that draws on more than the European sources. And in fact, more than we're often aware, although the Spanish had conquered the New World, Native American survivals, indeed independent Native American states, remained effective well into the 18th century. The Incas themselves simply moved to a kind of new Inca state in a region of the Peruvian lowlands that the Spaniards didn't reach until 50 years after the fall of Cuzco. In Vilcabamba, an Inca state survived until the 1580s, and elsewhere in the interior of Guatemala, in various regions in Mexico, in the cone of South America, natives either remained completely independent or allied themselves with Spanish religious orders to find a powerful protector against the extension of direct Spanish control. And so a new elite gradually emerges in the Spanish regions, including native elements with a kind of Creole attitude, and the term to describe it comes from the Spanish term that means mixed, mestizos. But the Native American and European elements aren't the only elements creating new kinds of societies. The slaves also made new societies in the New World. Indeed, the demographic profile of many colonies meant that they were much more African than they were European or even mestizo European Native American mix. In some parts of the Caribbean, in some parts of the Atlantic seaboard colonies where slavery and plantation agriculture were practiced, the European population was a tiny layer on top of hundreds of thousands of Africans. And so, in some respects, the slaves preserved in their own communities, even under the horrible conditions of slavery, their own religions, their own foodways. To communicate with each other, they even invented new lingua francas, new mixtures of speech that could become separate languages. If you've ever seen the Patriot with, that movie about the Revolutionary War, there's a section there which takes place in the Carolina coastline where you're introduced to Gullah communities. This was a West African origin dialect that became a lingua franca for some of the slaves in regions where they hardly ever saw white people. And as slaves ran away from their plantations and escaped, sometimes Native Americans helping them and protecting them, they established even separate, really, states in the hinterland of the plantation colony regions, not just in South America where they're famous, but even in parts of the hinterland of the Carolinas. The word for these independent runaway slaves was maroons, and the kind of states they established are referred to as maroon kingdoms. There are some very famous ones in the hinterland of today's Venezuela or Brazil. But even in regions where the Maroons didn't exactly establish kingdoms, for instance in Jamaica, the British colonial and plantation owner rulers could never stamp out the influence of the traditional important leaders of the slave community, the Obeah. And in the hills, they actually eventually had to recognize and write treaties with maroon states. So to kind of wrap up this set of lectures exploring the political and social developments of the 16th and 17th centuries, we can generalize by pointing out the obvious, that this was a period of great change around the entire globe. Some traditional empires continued to expand, such as the Ottoman. Others found religion and culture as a means to unify their people, such as the Safavids with Shia Islam in Persia. But at the same time, in some parts of the world, very new types of societies developed, in particular in the Americas. And it was the new global trade, as we've seen the impact of slave societies in America, that drove some of this change, including in some societies, particularly in Japan, that decided to completely turn away from the West. In Africa itself, the growing slave trade affected the development of new kingdoms, often by making them more militaristic and violent than their predecessors before the arrival of the mass slave trade across the Atlantic.